Today's news of Taiwan broadcast, July 28, 2026.
Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here with us. We've got a massive amount of breaking news to get through today. We're taking everything from vital public safety alerts to major global economic shifts, and we're distilling it all down into a highly structured visual synthesis for you. We're basically stripping away all the noise so you can get straight to the facts that actually matter to your daily life.
All right, so here is our agenda for today. We're breaking things down into 6 main areas: food safety and public health, public security and fraud, traffic and safety rules, global politics and the economy, health and outdoor risks, and finally, sports and lifestyle. Let's get right into it. Section 1, Food Safety and Public Health. We're looking specifically at the Zhonglian oil crisis. Okay, let's dive into this one. So, the FDA recently put out this independent third-party investigation into Zhonglian oil, which, as you might remember, was recently found to have excess levels of benzopyrene, a known carcinogen. And man, they found 3 major systemic management failures. First up, really poor raw material control. Second, inadequate process monitoring. And third, just total failures in inspection and testing. The really crucial takeaway here is that this wasn't just, a single mistake on a factory floor. This was a cascading, systemic failure across their entire production pipeline. Honestly, the core of this whole issue really boils down to one single number: 5%. Basically, Zhonglian altered their purchasing contracts for imported Brazilian soybeans. They shifted the accepted heat damage rate, which is essentially just a measure of how burnt the soybeans are allowed to be, from a really strict 0.5% all the way up to 5%. Now, relying strictly on the data here, food safety experts are pointing out that a higher heat damage rate directly correlates to a much higher risk of generating benzopyrene during the actual oil extraction process. As you can imagine, we saw some intense clashes over this data in the Taichung City Council. The DPP was demanding immediate accountability and apologies from the mayor, while the KMT pointed the finger straight at central government oversight and regulations. But looking at the actual productive outcome of this pretty fiery debate, they did agree to form a cross-party food safety investigation task force. They're going to review all the inspection records together to find structural fixes, rather than just trading blame back and forth. Moving on to Section 2, Public Security and Fraud Prevention. We're talking about deceptive daily threats. 2,150,000 new Taiwan dollars. I mean, wow, that is the staggering amount of money stolen across 13 different victims by a highly coordinated credit card theft ring, and they were operating right inside the MRT transit system. So how exactly did they pull this off? Well, this syndicate followed 4 really precise steps that kind of redefine modern pickpocketing. First, a suspect who came over to Taiwan from Hong Kong targeted incredibly crowded MRT stations in Taipei and Kaohsiung. Second, they'd stealthily steal a commuter's wallet. Third, and this is where it gets crazy technical, they used a smartphone's NFC capability to scan the stolen credit card's chip. Finally, they instantly transmitted that chip data to an overseas syndicate. This resulted in massive fraudulent purchases in places as far away as Saudi Arabia, literally before the victims even realized their wallets were gone. The main suspect has been caught, though, and is now facing over 9 years in prison. Sadly, criminals aren't just targeting our transit systems, they are targeting our hospitals, too. We've got a really important hospital scam alert for you. Scammers posing as retired hospital executives have been targeting anxious families waiting outside orthopedic operating rooms. They prey on these vulnerable families by offering, quote-unquote, discounted nutritional supplements, dropping the price from over $4,000 down to $2,750 NTD. They will even fake phone calls with hospital department heads to build trust, take your cash, and then completely vanish. Please, if you are ever in this situation, only buy medications directly from the official hospital pharmacy. All right, Section 3, Traffic Accidents and Safety Rules. We have some crucial takeaways to discuss. There was a really heartbreaking accident recently over in the Wenshan district where an 83-year-old woman was tragically struck and dragged by a bus after she tried to cross the street directly in front of the vehicle. So the crucial point here is understanding and actively avoiding the 4 major blind spots of large vehicles. Those are the front right A-pillar, the right side inner wheel difference, and the rear. As pedestrians, we absolutely cannot assume a bus driver can see us if we're in these zones. Giving large vehicles a wide berth is literally an absolute necessity for your safety on the road. Section 4, Global Politics and Economic Trends. Let's zoom out and take the macro view. looking at the geopolitical map right now, we are seeing some seriously conflicting narratives regarding Middle East stability. On one hand, U.S. statements are suggesting that friendly negotiations with Iran are underway and could actually lead to an agreement. But on the other hand, Iran has flatly denied resuming any nuclear talks, saying any current dialogue is purely technical. And this whole diplomatic friction is playing out against a super volatile backdrop. Houthi forces are continuing to launch drone attacks on Saudi Arabian oil facilities, which is keeping global oil prices and security highly, highly unpredictable.
Bringing that macro view a little closer to home, we're tracking two absolutely massive economic milestones. First, despite some recent stock market volatility, we're talking a 700-point intraday drop. Retail investor confidence is astonishingly strong right now. TSMC has officially surpassed 3 million shareholders. That is an absolute historic high. And on the labor front, based on OECD low-wage standards, there is a major proposed minimum wage hike on the table pushing for a 5.14% increase. That would bring the monthly minimum wage to 31,016 NTD and the hourly rate up to 206 NTD. Both of these metrics really show us just how dynamic and rapidly evolving the local economy is right now.
Okay, Section 5, Health Warnings and Outdoor Risks. This is all about protecting yourself. You might have seen this in the news, but the entertainment and music industries were recently shocked by the sudden deaths of 43-year-old actor Wang Kai and 56-year-old conductor Chen Yifu. Because of this, doctors are urgently reminding the public about the pre-attack symptoms of sudden cardiac arrest. You know, it's a total myth that people just drop without any warning. Watch out for these specific signs. Extreme, unexplained fatigue that doesn't get better with rest, abnormal sleep or breathing issues, pain radiating in your chest, shoulders, or upper abdomen, and sudden cold sweats. If you or someone you love experiences these, please do not brush them off. Seek medical attention immediately. And outdoor safety is just as critical. Down at Kinting's South Bay, a tourist got swept out to sea by a sudden rip current and had to be dramatically rescued by lifeguards on jet skis. So this is your vital reminder to always, always read the beach safety flags. It's simple. If you see 2 red flags, it means absolutely no swimming. If you see 3 red flags, all water activities are strictly banned. Understanding these flags can literally save your life when you're out enjoying the beach. Finally, Section 6, Sports Highlights and Lifestyle. Let's end things on a high note today, shall we? So, baseball legend Yang Dai-kang is officially retiring after a stellar 21-year career, and he leaves us with this really great thought. I want to go abroad to see different environments. It's a place where I've learned a lot. Yang played everywhere, across Taiwan, Japan, the US, and Australia. He was so incredibly respected in the sport that back in 2014, modern superstar Shohei Ohtani was famously photographed kneeling on the field just to intently listen to Yang's advice. What an incredible world-class legacy to leave behind. And hey, speaking of baseball, you have to hear this heartwarming story. So there's this kid in Arkansas named Henry, and he was live streaming a baseball card pack opening with his friends. Against truly astronomical odds, he pulled a 1 of 4 Aaron Judge Logoman Patch Redemption card. We are talking about one of the absolutely rarest, most valuable cards in the entire hobby. The pure joy of this kid literally jumping right over his living room couch in celebration is exactly the kind of uplifting, dream-come-true moment we all need to see today. Well, that brings us to the end of today's briefing. But before you go, I want to leave you with this final provocative question. In a world moving at breakneck speed, which of today's safety or economic takeaways will you apply to your life tomorrow? Really think about it. Whether it's steering clear of a bus's blind spot, recognizing a hidden health warning sign, or just staying vigilant on your morning commute, knowledge is power. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Stay safe out there, and I can't wait to see you next time.
This is the brief on today's top headlines. Today's major stories all revolve around hidden systemic risks, whether it's invisible contaminants in our food, silent digital theft on our morning commutes, or contradictory signals in global geopolitics. First, if you leave your front door wide open, you can't be surprised when disaster walks in, right? Well, that's exactly what happened with the Zhonglian soybean oil scandal, where investigators found dangerous levels of the carcinogen benzopyrene. This happened because import limits for heat-damaged Brazilian soybeans were drastically relaxed from a 0.5% limit up to 5% without updating manufacturing parameters. sparking huge protests and a special Taichung City Council investigation team. Second is the modern convenience of tap-to-pay actually turning our daily commutes into a massive, invisible security risk. A Hong Kong man surnamed Joe was just arrested for skimming credit card data on the Taipei and Kaohsiung MRT systems using literally just his smartphone and NFC tech. He silently stole chip data from 13 commuters, sending it abroad to ring up over 2.15 million NTD in fraudulent overseas charges. And prosecutors are now seeking a 9-year prison sentence. Finally, there's massive geopolitical whiplash happening in the Middle East right now. Donald Trump claims the US and Iran are having friendly talks with a high chance of an agreement, but Iran explicitly denied resuming nuclear talks. Meanwhile, Houthi rebels launched drone attacks on Saudi Arabian oil facilities. So how on earth are global oil prices actually dropping back to around $80 a barrel while refineries are literally catching fire? And are these political mixed signals just a smokescreen for market volatility? Staying vigilant and informed is our absolute best defense against these unseen local and global risks.
Welcome to the debate. Imagine the bottle of cooking oil sitting in your kitchen right now.
Right.
When you bought it, you probably assumed that the government had, thoroughly checked it, right?
Yeah, I think we all just assume that.
Exactly. But what if I told you that the authorities haven't tested the safety of that specific product in 8 years? And what if, during that massive blind spot, the company that made the oil decided to just legally rewrite their own safety rules, allowing burnt, chemically degraded ingredients to be processed into that very bottle?
It is frankly a completely jarring reality check. I mean, we walk through a supermarket and we desperately want food safety to be this, visible categorical certainty.
Right, we want guarantees.
We do. But when you look closely at the modern industrial food supply, those illusions of total safety tend to evaporate very, very quickly.
Which brings us to the focus of our analysis today, the massive food safety crisis surrounding Zhonglian oil. For those who haven't been following the news closely, soybean salad oil manufactured by this major company was recently found to contain excessive levels of a chemical called benzopyrene.
A very nasty chemical.
Extremely. Benzopyrene is a known carcinogen. It's something that we absolutely do not want in the human food supply. And the Ministry of Health and Welfare just released a comprehensive third-party independent investigation report detailing exactly how this chemical, slipped past all the defenses and ended up in consumer kitchens.
And it really forces a reckoning, I think, about where the true vulnerabilities lie and how we manufacture food on a global scale.
Exactly. And the central question we are unpacking today is this. Is this food safety crisis primarily a failure of governmental regulatory oversight and administrative negligence, or is it fundamentally a failure of corporate operational governance and deliberate risk mismanagement? I will be arguing that this is a systemic failure of government regulation. The state effectively fell asleep at the wheel, and they allowed a major corporation to dictate its own rules.
And I will be representing the perspective that this crisis is deeply rooted in deliberate, flawed corporate operational decisions. This was a calculated failure of corporate responsibility made inside the boardroom and on the factory floor, long before an inspector ever could have intervened.
Let me outline my position first. When I read through the Ministry of Health and Welfare's own third-party report, I was struck by how it explicitly cites 3 major management failures that led to this crisis. First, high-risk raw material management. Second, a total lack of process monitoring. And third, severe gaps in inspection and testing. To me, this exposes critical, foundational vulnerabilities in our public health infrastructure.
Well, sure, there are vulnerabilities.
But it's more than that. A regulatory system that allows a major food manufacturer to unilaterally change its raw material acceptance standards, meaning the quality of the beans they buy, without triggering an immediate mandatory regulatory intervention, that is inherently flawed. The government is supposed to be the ultimate backstop.
But a backstop is not a substitute for the primary player.
True, but when the backstop isn't even on the field, we have a massive problem. I mean, I was reading through the political fallout of this, and the thing that just stopped me in my tracks was the revelation at the local city council in Taichung.
Oh yeah, that was quite a scene.
Right? It came to light that the city government had not actually tested Zhonglian's oil in 8 years.
Yeah, an 8-year gap.
8 years without a proactive audit. How does a regulatory system just, forget to test a major food supplier for nearly a decade? That is not a corporate failure. That is the state completely abandoning its post.
I come at it from a different way. We have to recognize that government regulations are merely a baseline. They are the absolute minimum floor of acceptable behavior in a civilized society. The true root cause of this specific crisis isn't that a bureaucrat missed a test. It is corporate profit-driven negligence.
Oh, corporations will always seek profit, though.
Yes, but if we focus on the specific facts of the Zhonglian case, the company made a conscious, internal decision to alter their acceptance standard for Brazilian soybeans. They intentionally raised their allowable heat damage rate from under 0.5% all the way up to under 5%.
That is a massive jump.
It is a tenfold increase in degraded raw material. And furthermore, the company failed to adjust its manufacturing processes to mitigate the chemical risks associated with this much lower quality input.
But shouldn't the government have caught that?
No, because this represents a proactive, deliberate failure of corporate responsibility. No government inspector can preemptively catch an internal procurement tweak like that without literally living on the factory floor, monitoring every email between the purchasing department and the Brazilian suppliers.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you are treating the corporate environment as a black box that the government simply cannot peer into. Let's look closely at this raw material standard adjustment you just mentioned.
Okay.
You noted the tenfold relaxation of the heat damage rate, moving it from 0.5 to 5%. Look, if I burn 5% of my dinner, my kitchen is full of smoke and the food is going in the trash.
Right?
But here the company just legally passed it right through the machinery. Why does the regulatory framework permit the standard alteration in the first place without automatically triggering a safety review?
Well, let's dig into the chemistry and the mechanics of what a heat damage rate actually is, because it explains why this is a profound ethical failure on the company's part.
Sure.
When we talk about heat damage in soybeans, we are talking about beans that have been practically scorched during drying or transit, what we colloquially call burnt beans. Now, benzopyrene isn't something that is inherently inside a healthy soybean. It is a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon.
Right, a mouthful.
Exactly. It's a fancy way of saying it is a chemical compound that forms when organic matter is burned or scorched.
Right, it's the same reason we are told not to eat the heavily charred black parts of a grilled steak. The scorching creates the carcinogen.
Exactly. So the higher the heat damage rate in your raw soybeans, the higher the generation of benzopyrene during processing. And the company executives and their food scientists knew this basic chemistry. In fact, the data shows that in a specific March shipment from Brazil,
Which crucially was technically legal under their new self-imposed 5% standard.
exactly, it was legal under their internal standard, but it was chemically dangerous. They created a loophole for themselves to accept cheaper, degraded raw materials, knowing full well that burnt beans yield higher carcinogens.
Yeah, because it's cheaper.
Right, when global supply chains tighten, cheaper beans look incredibly attractive to a profit margin. They prioritized supply chain convenience and cost over consumer safety. A regulatory body can review contracts and test outputs eventually. But the moment-to-moment ethical decision of accepting a specific ship full of scorched beans rests entirely on the shoulders of corporate procurement officers. You simply cannot legislate a corporate conscience.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. You say we cannot legislate a corporate conscience, but isn't the entire purpose of a regulatory state to assume that a corporate conscience does not exist?
Well,
We build structural safeguards precisely because we know profit will always compete with safety. If the state's food scientists know that a heat damage rate directly correlates with benzopyrene generation, why is the allowable threshold left to a self-imposed corporate standard?
because the sheer volume of imports.
But the fact that a shipment hitting 0.53% was allowed to enter the processing phase highlights a massive blind spot in import inspections. The government allowed them to write their own rulebook.
I understand the desire to place a government inspector at every shipping container. I really do. But if we follow the beans down the assembly line to the actual manufacturing and process monitoring, this is where the mechanical reality of the failure becomes undeniable.
Okay.
Because even if you accept degraded, scorched beans as a manufacturer, you still have a fundamental obligation to process them safely. The third-party investigation revealed something astonishing. Zhonglian's existing deacidification and decolorization equipment was physically and chemically incapable of removing the higher levels of benzopyrene generated by these degraded soybeans.
Wait, stop there for a second. Explain the actual mechanics of that equipment failure, because I think the physical limitation of the machinery is a central piece of this puzzle that often gets glossed over.
Gladly. Think of the deacidification and decolorization processes in edible oil refinement like a highly specialized filtration system. They are designed primarily to remove free fatty acids and unwanted pigments, so the oil looks clear and tastes neutral.
Right.
Now, they can, in theory, remove a certain baseline amount of volatile organic compounds, but benzopyrene isn't a simple free fatty acid. It is a bulky, heavy ring chemical structure.
So it doesn't interact with the equipment the same way.
Exactly. It's like running extremely muddy, sludge-filled water through your standard refrigerator water filter. The refrigerator filter isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. But it was never mathematically designed to handle a toxic load of that magnitude.
Ah, I see.
So the sludge just passes right through the physical matrix into your glass. When you feed this refinery raw material that has a significantly higher concentration of heavy ring structures like benzopyrene, the chemical filters get completely overwhelmed. The output remains contaminated.
And the company knew what equipment they were running.
They absolutely did. Zhonglian proceeded with full-scale production anyway. They didn't slow down the assembly line. They didn't upgrade their filtration media. They didn't recalibrate the deacidification parameters to handle the increased toxic load. They just pushed it through.
Wow.
Yeah, the third-party report explicitly stated they lacked a benzopyrene monitoring measure within their own real-time process. That is a deliberate engineering and processing failure. It is an internal operational choice, not a regulatory blind spot.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective. Identifying that exact mathematical mismatch is the textbook definition of an operational audit. Think about it. If a piece of industrial deacidification equipment is rated to handle a toxic load of X, and the raw material being inputted has a toxic load of Y, the government health and safety agencies should be looking at that math.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are asking the government to play the role of the company's chief engineer. The complexity of modern food production means there are thousands of parameters running simultaneously in a plant like that. Temperatures, pressures, flow rates, chemical dosing.
But they don't have to monitor thousands of parameters manually if they enforce proper systems. If the machinery was destined to fail when processing these degraded beans, why didn't the government's safety net catch that mathematical mismatch before the oil hit the shelves?
Because they aren't on the factory floor.
But the fact that it required a post-incident, third-party expert panel convened by the Ministry of Health and Welfare to uncover this equipment limitation proves my point. It proves that proactive, real-time regulatory audits are severely lacking. If the government is only analyzing the mechanics of a failure after the carcinogens are already in consumer kitchens, then the regulatory system is operating entirely in the rearview mirror.
But you are shifting the blame away from the entity pulling the levers. If a driver decides to put cheap, heavily contaminated fuel in a high-performance engine, and the engine predictably seizes up and causes a crash, we don't blame the highway patrol for failing to check his fuel tank at the on-ramp. We blame the driver for a deliberate mechanical mismatch.
I'm not entirely sure the contaminated fuel analogy holds up perfectly when the resulting crash directly poisons thousands of unwitting consumers who just wanted to, stir-fry their vegetables.
Fair enough, but
let's follow your logic and move this discussion from the factory floor to the government response. Because to me, the administrative accountability, or total lack thereof, is staggering. We have to look at the political deflection happening at the highest levels of the central government right now.
oh, here we go.
We have a minister without portfolio in the executive yuan, essentially a top-level central government official, publicly defending the local health agencies. He stated, and I quote, "Politics is politics, professionalism is professionalism." He is essentially arguing that there was no administrative negligence simply because the FDA equivalents and the local health bureaus are exhausted.
Well, To be fair, the phrase he used in the press conference roughly translates to the local inspectors being turned completely upside down with exhaustion, dealing with an impossibly massive workload.
Yes, turned upside down. And look, I have deep sympathy for overworked public servants. I really do. But bureaucratic exhaustion does not excuse the fundamental failure to protect consumers.
True, but
Let's think about the day in the life of a local health inspector. They are underfunded, they are running around chasing food poisoning outbreaks at local restaurants, and suddenly they are supposed to audit a massive industrial refinery's chemical processing thresholds. If the system is so under-resourced that it misses a massive systemic poisoning of the food supply, that is a failure of the state apparatus.
I mean, they only have so many hours in a day.
Exactly. And it certainly does not excuse the revelation we talked about earlier that the city government had a completely blind eye toward this specific oil for 8 years. You cannot separate the politics from the professionalism when the professional standard drops to 0 proactive tests in nearly a decade.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered how focusing overwhelmingly on government oversight inevitably descends into exactly this kind of unhelpful partisan finger-pointing?
What do you mean?
Look at what actually happened in the local city council over this exact issue. It was pure political theater. You had members of the ruling political party literally rushing the legislative podium, screaming and demanding that the local mayor apologize for the 8-year testing gap.
Yeah, that was intense.
And in response, what did the opposition party do? They held up physical cardboard signs blaming the president and the premier of the central government for the crisis. They completely shut down the legislative session.
It was quite a spectacle. It ground local governance to a halt for a period.
Exactly. And I have to ask, what does that screaming match achieve for actual food safety?
Well, visibility, maybe.
When we frame these industrial crises primarily as governmental failures, we invite this endless cycle of partisan blame shifting. The central government blames the local government blames the central government, and meanwhile the corporate executives who actually poisoned the oil are quietly sitting in the background, entirely shielded from the spotlight.
It is definitely easier for politicians to yell at a mayor than it is to regulate a multinational supply chain, I'll give you that.
Precisely. This political theater distracts from the core solution. And the core solution is holding the specific corporate entity directly, legally, and financially responsible for their supply chain choices. If a company knows that a failure in their deacidification process will result in immediate, catastrophic financial liability, rather than just a slap on the wrist while politicians yell at each other, that is a much faster, much more effective route to food safety. We don't need to wait for exhausted bureaucrats to catch every operational tweak if the financial penalty for poisoning the public is an existential threat to the company.
I hear what you were saying about the toxicity of the political theater. The shouting matches and the cardboard signs do not remove carcinogens from our salad oil.
Right.
But we cannot let our distaste for political grandstanding blind us to the very real administrative vacuum that the grandstanding highlights. When that central government official tries to build a wall between politics and professionalism, he is deliberately ignoring the fact that public health funding, auditing mandates, and inspection frequencies are inherently political decisions.
They are political resource allocations, yes.
Exactly. And if we just rely on corporate financial liability after the fact, as you suggest, we are implicitly accepting a system where consumers must be harmed first in order to trigger the financial penalty.
Not necessarily.
It is a reactive system, not a preventative one. We need laws that force transparency before the damage is done.
But a preventative system driven entirely by the state is a logistical impossibility in a highly privatized, complex global market.
The ministry's third-party report itself diagnoses this as a multi-layered failure of the manufacturer's own making. It wasn't just a raw material, it was the failure to monitor the benzopyrene and the failure to recalibrate the processing parameters. These are highly technical, moment-to-moment operational decisions. A company altering a contract with a Brazilian soybean supplier to accept a 5% heat damage rate is a private transaction. The state cannot pre-approve every private procurement contract a company signs. We have to demand tighter corporate ethics and robust internal risk governance, simply because the corporation is the only entity with real-time access to its own factory floor.
which is exactly why the regulations need to mandate real-time data sharing of those critical processing parameters. We shouldn't allow the capability of a deacidification machine to remain a corporate trade secret until a carcinogen crisis forces a third-party investigation to pry the doors open.
So you want the machine's chemical thresholds streamed to a government server somewhere?
I want the math to be verifiable before the product leaves the facility.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare.
Maybe, but I think we are arriving at a vital point of convergence here. As we look at the conclusions we can draw from this entire crisis, my stance remains that without robust, proactive government audits, public safety is entirely vulnerable to the pressures of the global market. We need officials who are willing to admit administrative gaps, like an 8-year lapse in testing, and actually fix them rather than playing political defense and blaming bureaucratic exhaustion.
And my summary of this situation remains that this crisis ultimately demonstrates that corporate choices are the primary drivers of risk in the food supply. The dangerous, deliberate mismatch between accepting scorched to graded raw materials and failing to utilize processing equipment actually capable of handling that degradation, that is a failure of corporate governance. The manufacturer held all the cards. They understood the chemistry, and they played their hand poorly just to save money on raw materials.
Yet, despite our different angles on who holds the primary blame, we both clearly acknowledge that the staggering complexity of modern industrial food production requires a deeply modernized ecosystem.
Absolutely. It demands both an unyielding standard of corporate ethics and a much more agile, scientifically literate regulatory framework. The Ministry of Health and Welfare's third-party report is actually a very vital first step in diagnosing this dual failure. It didn't just point a single political finger. It mapped out the mechanical and chemical realities of the breakdown.
It really is a roadmap for exactly how complex these systems are, and it highlights the immense value of looking past the partisan shouting matches, like those we saw disrupting the local city council, to truly understand the physical realities of industrial food production. There is so much more to explore in how local governance, public accountability, and these massive private supply chains intersect.
We have to move past the political noise if we ever want to actually fix the machine.
Which brings us back to where we started. We all want to believe that there is a rigid, foolproof system keeping us safe from chemical hazards in our supermarkets. But as this Zhonglian oil crisis shows, the barrier protecting our food supply is incredibly porous. And right now, we are relying on both exhausted, underfunded regulators and profit-driven operators to decide what passes through it. We need to stop treating food safety as a final checkpoint at the factory door and start treating it as a continuous, transparent system where the math and the chemistry have to add up at every single step. Thank you for listening.